So, Joe, that side-by-side meeting between Macron and President Trump in the Oval Office yesterday, just fascinating to watch their body language and then, of course, to listen to the substance of what they were saying.
Their body language, the substance of what they're saying, the annual handshaking contest. It's always fascinating when these two get together. You never know exactly what is going to happen. Of course, talking about Ukraine, that was the context of the meeting. And of course, for much of what went on yesterday, Willie, and we're going to start talking about that meeting and Ukraine. But first, I want to just briefly read from the Wall Street Journal editorial page today, who aptly calls yesterday what it was, a sad day for the United States at the UN. And in one part of it, the Wall Street Journal editorial page writes this: perhaps Donald Trump thinks that telling the truth about Russia will cause Mr. Putin to walk away from Ukraine negotiations. Ronald Reagan, who also sought peace and achieved it, never shrank from telling the truth about the Soviet Union. The truth was an essential weapon in defeating what Reagan called an evil empire. And they end by saying it's hard to be optimistic if you won't tell the truth about which country started the war. So, Willie, really just a stunning moment yesterday where the United States of America sided with an invader in blocking a UN resolution on the third anniversary of an invasion that the entire world saw. They know who the dictator is, just like the New York Post said to Donald Trump last week. The world knows who the dictator is. The world knows who invaded whom, and the world knows who is on the side of freedom and who's on the side of tyranny. And right now, the United States, officially at the United Nations, does not.
Yeah, and a stark contrast yesterday as there were remembrances around the world from Western democratic nations, free nations, siding, of course, with Ukraine, victims of the invasion 3 years ago. But the United States at the UN, as you point out, breaking ranks with those European allies, joining Russia and North Korea, among others, in opposing a resolution that calls for Russia to withdraw from all occupied territory in Ukraine. The U.S. instead proposed a separate resolution avoiding territorial language, mirroring recent Trump administration suggestions that Ukraine may have to cede land to get peace. Ultimately, the United States abstained on its own measure after European amendments strengthened its wording. Despite U.S. opposition, Ukraine's resolution did pass with 93 votes. President Trump was asked yesterday about American opposition to that UN resolution.
Can you explain the rationale in having the U.S. vote against the UN resolutions that Ukraine proposed and also the U.S. proposed?
I would rather not explain it now, but it's sort of self-evident, I think.
So, John, if you look at the front page of the Journal, Joe is reading from the op-ed pages. On the news side, U.S. sides with Russia, China against Ukraine in UN vote. We could add Belarus and North Korea to the company the U.S. is keeping at the UN yesterday.
Yeah, international pariahs for the most part. Again, it's worth taking a moment reflecting on how things have changed over 3 years. When this war began, we heard from President Biden locking arms with Ukraine and our European allies to say they will support Kyiv till the very end. President Biden said that the U.S. backing of Ukraine's efforts to repel Russia would be unwavering, and of course sent billions of dollars over time for weapons and munitions. And now, over the last few days, we have President Trump prioritizing his phone call and relationship with President Putin. We have a meeting, our first talks between U.S. and Russian officials in Saudi Arabia, Ukraine not invited. We have Trump calling Zelensky a dictator and being pressed as to whether Putin is the same, will not answer, and doing so repeatedly. And now we have here at the UN, the United States refusing to acknowledge in plain language what happened, which was this is a war of Russian aggression, that Russia is the one who invaded. And of course, subtext here, this war could end at any time if Vladimir Putin would simply call off his troops. And we should note, even as there are now talks, the peace process may be on its way to beginning, Russian is not only continuing, but escalating their bombardment of Ukrainian cities with drone strikes and the like. So We saw French President Macron there yesterday flat out contradict Trump at a couple of moments, saying that no, Europe gave this money to Ukraine. We're not expecting it to be paid back. Suggesting this was a cause that Europe would still continue to support, as much as there is an acknowledgement, Willie, that yes, we are nearing likely the end stages. There will be some sort of negotiations. Trump suggesting that a minerals deal may still be part of this, and that Zelensky may be coming to the White House the next week or so.
That was a telling moment in the Oval Office when a reporter said, "You have called Zelensky a dictator. Is Putin a dictator?" Donald Trump would not answer and changed the subject. Meanwhile, President Trump's White House meeting yesterday with President Macron came on the third anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And while the two leaders were friendly, their views about the war and each other's support for Ukraine were vastly different. The French president said a peace deal must not mean a surrender for Ukraine. It must not mean a ceasefire without guarantees, and it must allow for Ukrainian sovereignty. Meanwhile, President Trump refused to call Russian President Vladimir Putin a dictator and was focused mainly on recouping billions of dollars in U.S. aid to Ukraine. Macron briefly corrected Trump when the president said Europe was already getting repaid.
You called Zelensky a dictator. Would you use the same words regarding Putin?
I don't use those words lightly. I think that we're going to see how it all works out. Let's see what happens. I think we have a chance of a really good settlement between various countries. And, you're talking about Europe, and you're talking about Ukraine as part of that whole situation. The other side has a lot of support also. So let's see how it all works out. It might work out. Look, you can never make up lives. The one thing you can make up the money, but you can't make up the lives. A lot of lives lost. I think probably a lot more lives than people are talking about. It's been a rough war, but I think we're close to getting it solved. Europe is loaning the money to Ukraine. They get their money back.
No, in fact, to be frank, we paid 60% of the total effort, and it was through, like the U.S., loans, guarantee, grants, and we provided real money. To be clear, we have 230 billion frozen assets in Europe, Russian assets, but this is not as a collateral of a loan because this is not our belonging. So they are frozen. If at the end of the day, in the negotiation we will have with Russia, they're ready to give it to us, super. It will be loan at the end of the day, and Russia will have paid for that.
If you believe that, it's okay with me. But they get their money back, we don't, and now we do. But, that's only fair.
It's just not true. It's really not. I mean, what Macron said was true. Frank Foer, so much about this is just double speak. We live in really an upside down world right now, especially, well, domestically and when it comes to foreign policy. But you actually have a piece in The Atlantic, and it's a man who actually stands up to Trump. And you say Zelensky's willingness to stand up to President Donald Trump, holding true to American values in the face of American intimidation, was a perverse trading of places. And I think back, all the way back to Harry Truman in 1947, the Truman Doctrine, the creation of NATO, the Berlin airlift, the United States standing up time and time again to those that the Soviet Union, that the Russians would want to oppress. What happened in 1980 when the Soviets were about to go into Poland, and the so-called Porcupine Doctrine that the Carter administration and Dr. Brzezinski put together, saying, sure, go into Poland if you want. We'll make sure it's like swallowing a porcupine. You don't want to do it. What we did throughout the 1980s, our support for solidarity all the way up to the Berlin Wall going down, the United States, first in defeating Nazism and then defeating Soviet tyranny. We've always known what side we were on when it came to fighting against Soviet and Russian aggression. Yesterday, just absolutely stunning and a stinging rebuke to most everything American foreign policy has stood for the better, for 80 years.
Right. It's an upside down world. And part of the reason it's upside down are the values that are infusing Trump Trump's foreign policy here, that Ukraine, which was the victim of Russian aggression, we're not even able to acknowledge that fact. And here the president is trying to basically extort Ukraine in its incredibly vulnerable state. Zelensky initially proposed this idea that there could be some sharing of his nation's resources as a gesture of gratitude. It was his form of trying to suck up to Trump initially. But then when Scott Bessent arrived in Kyiv to negotiate the terms of this, it wasn't a negotiation. He pushed, in mob-like fashion, he pushed a piece of paper across the desk to Zelensky and said, these are the terms. And these were terms that were just punitive, that they were trying to Zelensky, who's been a kind of perpetual thorn in Trump's side, going back to that very beautiful phone call that they had that was provoked the first impeachment. He's always had this animus towards Zelensky, and here that animus was being imposed on the entirety of Ukraine.
Yeah, but Frank, the thing about that deal is, it would be one thing if you pushed these outrageous demands across the table at Zelensky, who's siding with the country that's repelling Russian aggression. But there was no security guarantee even attached to that. It was, give us all your money and we will give you nothing in return. It wasn't even, like, you know, you said, like, you compared to the mob. It wasn't even that, because there was no protection afforded. It was, give us all your money and we give you nothing in return.
Right. Exactly. There was it was extortion. There was nothing on the other side for Ukraine. And when Zelensky first proposed that deal, he was saying, look, you know, we know that you're going to take risk in protecting us and guaranteeing our security. So here are some access to some of our valuable minerals in exchange. Instead, Trump was behaving like a Russian oligarch. And in the end, shouldn't Russia be the one that has to pay some sort of price for having invaded Ukraine? It's perverse to impose those costs on Ukraine, the victim.
Yeah, I mean, NATO membership is a big step, and President Zelensky had said he would step aside if his nation could be given a path, at least, to NATO membership, but nothing there so far from the Trump administration.